Welcome back to the study. The fire is still burning. Leave the noise, the haste, and the relentless demands of the modern world outside that door. Step out of the iron cage, pull up a chair, and simply rest for a while. When the average reader, or indeed the average aspiring writer, thinks about the monumental task of creating a fantasy world, they envision a very specific, logical progression of events. They imagine an author sitting alone at a wooden desk, hunched over a vast, terrifyingly blank sheet of parchment. The process usually begins with geography. The author takes a quill and sketches the jagged outlines of a fictional continent. They rise towering, impassable mountain ranges to create natural borders. They carve deep river valleys, scatter ancient forests across the plains, and dot the coastlines with bustling port cities. Once this geographical stage is fully constructed, the author then breathes life into it. They invent political faction, design complex systems of magic, and finally, they drop their heroes and villains onto this beautifully painted board, winding them up like clockwork toys to see how they will collide. This is the natural, intuitive human reflex of world building. You build the theater first, you paint the backdrop, and only then you invite the actors onto the stage to speak their lines. But John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, the undisputed grand architect of the most enduring myth in modern literature, did not do this. He inverted the very act of creation. Tolkien did not begin with a map of Middle-earth. He did not begin with a convoluted magic system, nor did he start with a grand, epic narrative about a dark lord and a cursed ring. He did not even begin with the hobbits. He began, quite simply, with the world. To truly understand the architecture of Middle-earth, to comprehend why it feels so impossibly heavy and real compared to almost every other fantasy realm, we must first strip Tolkien of the title of novelist, and to drape him into the robes of a scholar. Tolkien was, by trade, by passion, and by deep spiritual calling, a philologist. He was a master of ancient dialects, a professor of Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, and Welsh at Oxford University. He was a man who spent his early academic years meticulously researching the historical roots of Germanic words for the renowned Oxford English Dictionary. For a philologist of his caliber, words were not merely called utilitarian tools used for communication. They were not just arbitrary sequences of letters. To Tolkien, words were living, breathing organisms. They were born in the primitive fires of ancient tribes. They aged, they mutated, they traveled across oceans, and they slowly weathered over centuries, much like stones polished by a relentless river. Most importantly, words carried within their very syllables the forgotten histories, the cultural memories, and the psychological traumas of the people who spoke them. Tolkien possessed a profound sensitivity to what we call phonoaesthetics, the inherent musical beauty of sound within language. He believed that certain combinations of vowels and consonants could evoke specific emotions, independently of their actual meaning. But he harbored a fascinating, almost obsessive compulsion that went far beyond merely studying the languages of the past. He wanted to create his own, from the absolute bedrock up. We are not talking about the superficial substitution of letters, or the random stringings together of harsh syllables to sound sufficiently alien, a cheap trick far too common in modern fantasy. Tolkien engineered precise, mathematically rigorous linguistic systems. He crafted languages with their own strict grammatical rules, distinct phonetics, complex syntax, and, crucially, a sprawling, consistent etymological history. From this deep obsession, Quenya was born, the High Elven tongue. For its aesthetic foundation, Tolkien drew heavily upon the fluid, sonorous vowels of Finnish, marrying them with the austere, commanding dignity of Latin. Shortly after, Sindarin took shape, the language of the Grey Elves, echoing with the cooler, breathier, more melancholic Celtic tones of Walish. These were not mere ciphers, they were languages of extraordinary, heartbreaking beauty, possessing their own internal rhythm and deep poetry. He spent countless nights in the trenches of the First World War, and later in his quiet Oxford study, meticulously conjugating fictional verbs and tracing the roots of fictional nouns. However, as these magnificent languages grew, the philologist encountered a profound intellectual paradox. A paradox that would ultimately become the spark that ignited the universe of Arda. Language, as Tolkien knew better than any man alive, cannot exist in a sterilized, historical vacuum. It is not a specimen that can be pinned to a corkboard and preserved in a dictionary. Language is the ultimate byproduct of breeding, suffering, evolving culture. It reflects the precise mentality of the minds that use it. A language must contain names for specific species of trees that grow in a specific, unique climate. It must have words for constellations seen only from a certain latitude. Words are born from the brutal, pragmatic human necessity to describe the surrounding terrain, to navigate complex social hierarchies, to express religious devotion, and to declare bloody wars. A language without a nation, without a geography, and without a deep history is nothing more than a beautiful dead construct. A ghost without a haunted house. In one of his letters, Tolkien wrote a sentence that serves as the absolute, unshakable dogma of his world-building method. He confessed that the stories were not made to provide a vehicle for his invented languages. It was exactly the reverse. The stories were made to provide a world for the languages. I want you to meditate on that for a moment as you listen to the rain against the glass, the breathtaking architecture of Arda, the blinding divine light of Valinor, the hubris and catastrophic downfall of the island of Númenor, the tragic sweeping battles of the First Age, and the exhausting, desperate trek of solitary hobbit into the heart of the shadowed mountain. All of it, every single page, is a gigantic, obscenely brilliant scaffolding. A scaffolding erected with unimaginable toil, solely so that strings of fictional words would have a space where they could finally, legitimately exist. Tolkien reverse engineered the act of creation. Instead of looking at an existing world and giving things names, he created an entire cosmos simply to justify the existence of his nomenclature. When you wander into the ancient golden woods of Lothlorien, on the pages of his book, the speech of Lady Galadriel feels authentic to you. It does not feel authentic because the author cleverly invented a few magical sounding phrases to spice up a chapter. It feels authentic because that specific language had lived, evolved, and matured in the mind of the creator decades before the very first Malorn tree of Middle-earth even been conceived. The name of the rivers, the hidden valleys, the ancient kings, they all possess true philological roots. When Gandalf stands before the doors of Durin and desperately searches for the password, or when Aragorn softly sings the lay of Lothlorien in the dark, we are not hearing linguistic chaos. We are hearing organic, phonetic evolution that has rolled across millennia. This deep linguistic foundation dictates the psychology of the world. The immortal elves, bound to the physical fate of the continent until its bitter end, utilized the singing flowing Quenya to describe their worlds through a lens of slow, fading, and melancholic beauty. The dwarfs, on the other hand, stubborn, forged from stone and born in the lightless depths, guarded their secret in Khazad-dûl. It was a harsh, guttural, consonantal language, born of paranoia and pride, which they rarely taught to anyone outside their own kin. The language shaped the psychology, and the psychology dictated the history of the wars that bled the continent dry. This is the primary reason why almost all of Tolkien's imitators ultimately fail to capture his magic. Modern creators often draw colorful maps, inventing the names of capitals on the fly, shuffling letters around until they sound appropriately epic or foreign. The resulting effect is always a cardboard world, a Hollywood movie set with freshly painted facades. When you walk through it, your subconscious mind instantly recognizes that there is nothing behind the doors. It is an illusion. Middle-earth is not a cardboard set. Middle-earth is an ancient, towering oak tree. You can count its rings. You can trace the deep grooves in the bark, and you can follow its roots deep into the soil of myth. And the deepest, oldest seat of the immense tree, the genesis from which the entirety of creation bloomed, was a single word. A word whispered in an invented tongue by a solitary scholar at an old wooden desk, long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. The language demanded an epic, and so the myth became flesh. There is a fatal flaw in the architecture of most modern fantasy worlds. It is a subtle error, but the human subconscious detects it almost immediately. When you open a poorly constructed fantasy novel, or step into a hastily designed virtual world, you are often struck by the overwhelming sensation of the present tense. The world feels entirely synthetic because it behaves as if it was born on the exact same day the protagonists began their journey. The cities are merely backdrops waiting for the heroes to arrive. The ancient temples exist only to hold the specific artifact the plot requires. The forests are merely obstacles placed on the road to the final battle. It feels like a theatrical stage where the paint on the background scenery is still wet. The world has no memory, it has no scars, it has no history independent of the narrative you are currently consuming. Realism is the art of sub-creation, does not come from the geographical accuracy of a map. It does not come from meticulously calculating the trade routes of fictional merchants, or from explaining the exact caloric intake of a dragon. Realism comes from the suffocating, majestic weight of lost history. It comes from melancholy of antiquity. To achieve this, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien utilized a concept that we might call deep time. It is a concept borrowed not from literature, but from geology and archaeology. Tolkien was a man of Europe, an Englishman surrounded by the physical detritus of the past. To walk through the English countryside is to walk over the bones of Roman legions, beneath the shadow of crumbling Norman keeps, and past Celtic barrows hidden in the morning mist. In Europe, history is not a theoretical concept. It is a physical layer of earth beneath your boots. Tolkien transplanted this profound sense of archaeological weight directly into the soil of Middle-earth. He understood that a world only feels undeniably real when the characters within it are dwarfed by the sheer scale of the time that has preceded them. This is why his decision to set The Lord of the Rings during the waning years of the Third Age is an absolute masterstroke of world-building. He did not place his grand narrative in the First Age, an era of mythological genesis where gods walked the earth and elves fought apocalyptic wars against the first Dark Lord, Morgoth. He did not place it in the Second Age, an era defined by the rise and catastrophic Atlantean fall of the great human empire of Numenor. No, he placed his most famous story in the late autumn of the world. When Frodo Baggins steps out of the Shire, he's not stepping into a fresh, vibrant, burgeoning world. He's stepping into a post-apocalyptic landscape. He's walking through the twilight of an era, traversing a continent that has already seen its greatest days come and go, millennia before he was even born. Magic is slowly bleeding out of the earth. The elves are retreating to the west. Their time is over. The great kingdoms of men have fractured and decayed. The Fellowship of the Ring does not chart new, unexplored territories. They walk through the graveyard of their own ancestors. Consider the incredible cinematic moment when the Fellowship drifts in their small boats down the great river Anduin. They do not merely pass between two mountains. They pass through the gates of Argonath, two colossal monolithic statues of ancient human kings, Isildur and Anarion, carved directly into the living rock of the gorge. Their left hands are raised in a gesture of eternal warning, their stone eyes gazing north, defying enemies that have long since turned to dust. Tolkien does not stop the narrative to give the reader a dry, 10-page encyclopedia entry about the architectural construction of these monuments. We experience them exactly as the characters do, from the bottom, looking up, feeling incredibly small, insignificant, and awestruck by the sheer magnitude of a forgotten past. The Argonath are not there to serve the plot. They are there to serve the world. They stand as silent witnesses to the tragic decline of the kingdom of Gondor. And shortly after, the characters arrive at Amon Hen, the Hill of Hearing, and the Seat of Seeing, ancient observation posts built by men of high lineage, now overgrown with moss, choked by creeping vines, and slowly surrendered back to the forest. The heroes sit on the ruined thrones of their forefathers, surrounded by the crushing silence of an empire that forgot its own greatness. But perhaps the greatest testament to the architecture of ruins in Middle-earth is the terrifying descent into Khazad-dûm, Moria. In lesser hands, Moria would simply be a dungeon, a dark maze filled with monsters to test the hero's combat skills. But Tolkien frames Moria as a psychological tragedy. It is a subterranean necropolis. It is the corpse of the greatest dwarven civilization that ever exists. A city of staggering beauty, of endless pillars carved like stone trees, of mithril veins and starlight mirrored in dark, silent pools. When the Fellowship finds the tomb of Balin in the chambers of Mazarbul, they do not just find a plot device. They find a shattered, desperate final record written in blood by a colony that was slowly, methodically slaughtered in the dark. They cannot get out. They are coming. The horror of Moria is not just the Balrog. The true horror is the tangible, suffocating grief of a dead civilization. The realization that the golden age of dwarves is gone, and that all their incredible craftsmanship, their pride, and their history have been reduced to echoes in the dark, inherited by the goblins and shadow. This brings us to the most vital technique Tolkien used to simulate the illusion of deep time, the art of restraint, the power of leaving things unexplained. Throughout the narrative, characters constantly sing songs, recite poems, or casually mention ancient kings, lost realms, and legendary battles in passing. Aragorn softly chants the Lay of Leithian, singing of the mortal man Beren and the elven princess Lúthien. Elrond references Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor, whose spear was named Aeglos. Characters speak of the fall of Gondolin, of the two trees of Valinor, and the dragon Ansalagon the Black. And crucially, Tolkien rarely stops to fully explain what these things are. He treats the reader not as a tourist requiring a guidebook, but a foreigner visiting a deeply ancient culture. If you walk into a pub in London, people do not stop to explain who Winston Churchill or Queen Victoria were every time they are mentioned. They are simply part of the cultural bedrock. By having characters casually reference a vast, unwritten mythology, Tolkien creates an optical illusion of infinite depth It is like looking into a dark forest pool. You can see the leaves floating on the surface. That is the main plot of the Fellowship. You can see the fish swimming a few feet down. That is the immediate history of the ring. But below that, the water turns black. You cannot see the bottom. You know the depth is there. You can feel the pressure of it, but your eyes cannot pierce it. That impenetrable depth is what makes the pool real. If Tolkien had explained everything, if he had eliminated every dark corner of the lore within the main text, the world would have instantly shrunk. It would have become finite. A world that can be fully explained is a world that can be fully contained, and thus a world that is fundamentally small. Middle-earth feels vast because it is riddled with the ruins of things we will never fully understand. The reader, much like the hobbits, is merely a brief, fleeting visitor walking through the long, dark shadow cast by history. But where did that history begin? Before the ruins, before the elves, before the shape of the continents themselves were drawn. How does a world actually begin? Every civilization needs a myth of creation, and the architect of Arda did not build his cosmos with stone or fire or light. He built it with music. Every great civilization, whether forged in the fires of human history or born in the quiet sanctuary of a writer's mind, requires a genesis, a founding myth. If a fictional world is merely a geographical container for a plot, it does not need a cosmology. It only needs a starting line. But if a world is to be a true subcreation, a breathing, autonomous reality that can sustain the weight of its own history, it must possess an answer to the ultimate, terrifying question: how did the void become matter? In modern fantasy, the creation of the world is often treated as a mechanical, almost bureaucratic process. We are presented with pantheons of squabbling gods who forge the earth like blacksmiths hammering iron, or cosmic dragons who breathe the continents into existence. Furthermore, the mystical forces within these worlds, the magic systems, are frequently reduced to rigid scientific equations. Input energy, recite a spell, output a fireball. Magic is treated as a utilitarian tool, a weapon, a resource to be mined. Tolkien, the philologist and devout Catholic, rejected this mechanical view of the cosmos entirely. To find the absolute bedrock of Middle-earth, we must leave the ruins of the Third Age far behind. We must look past the creation of the elves, past the shaping of the mountains, and step outside of the boundaries of time itself. We must open the pages of the Silmarillion and read the Ainur, the music of the Ainur. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Ilúvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. These are the opening words of Tolkien's mythology. Before there was light, before there was earth, there was only the timeless halls, and there was Eru, the One. Eru did not create the universe with a hammer. He created the Ainur, angelic primordial spirits born from different facets of his own infinite mind. And to each of these spirits he gave a voice. For a countless age he taught them to sing. At first they sang alone, or in small groups, while the others listened, slowly coming to understand the minds of their brethren. And then Eru Iluvatar declared a mighty design. He propounded to them a grand, overcharging musical theme, and he commanded them to weave this theme into a great music. They were to use their own individual creativity, their own unique voices to adorn and expand upon his original melody. Thus began the greatest symphony ever conceived. The voices of the Ainur, like harps and lutes, like pipes and trumpets, like viols and organs, and like countless choirs singing with words, began to wave a sound of endless, shifting melodies. The music rose and fell. It wove a tapestry of unimaginable harmonic beauty that filled the timeless halls and spilled out into the void, until the void was no longer empty. This is the most crucial architectural pillar of Tolkien's universe. The fabric of reality is not made of atoms or dark matter or the rigid magical currents. The fabric of reality is song. But a story without conflict is merely a static painting. And the conflict of Arda did not begin with a sword strike or a betrayal in the dark throne room. The original sin of the universe was a musical dissonance. Among the Ainur, there was one named Melkor. He was the greatest of them all, granted the greatest gifts of power and knowledge. But Melkor grew impatient. He wandered into the empty void alone, seeking the flame imperishable, the very power of creation, wanting to bring things into being of his own will, independent of Eru. He did not find the flame, for it belonged to Eru alone. But in his solitude, Melkor began to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. When the great music began, Melkor sought to wave these private, prideful thoughts into the harmony. He wanted to increase the power and the glory of the part assigned to himself. He began to sing a loud, vain, and repetitive melody. It was not a beautiful variation. It was a brazen, clamorous cacophony designed to drown out the others. This is Tolkien's profound philosophical thesis on the nature of evil. Evil, in Tolkien mythos, is not an original creative force. Evil cannot invent. It can only mock, distort, and corrupt what is already beautiful. Melkor's music was a violent rebellion of ego against harmony. As Melkor's dissonance grew, a war of sound raged in the timeless halls. Some of the Ainur faltered, their melodies broken, and they attuned their own voices to Melkor's brassy rhythm. The great music became a raging storm of sound, a sea of turbulent, clashing waves. 3 times Eru Ilúvatar rose. 3 times he introduced a new theme to counter the chaos of Melkor. And with the final deepest chord, a sound deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, and piercing as the light of the eye of Eru, the music abruptly ceased. In the silence that followed, Eru Ilúvatar led the Ainur out into the void and showed them a vision. He showed them what their song had done. He showed them a world suspended in the darkness. The Ainur looked upon it in awe, for they saw their music had not merely been sound, it had been the blueprint of the physical reality. They saw the unfolding history of Middle-earth. They saw the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men. And in a moment of supreme divine revelation, Eru spoke to Melkor. He told him that no theme could be played that did not have its uttermost source in Eru himself. Melkor's attempt to destroy the music had only resulted in the creation of things more wonderful than he would have ever imagined. Where Melkor had sung of extreme, bitter cold to freeze the waters of the earth, he had inadvertently created the breathtaking beauty of snowflakes and frost. Whether he had sung of violent, unquenchable heat to dry the lands, he had forged the majestic, towering clouds and the sweet sound of rain. Melkor's rebellion, his dissonance, was the very thing that gave the world its tragic, heartbreaking depth. Then Eru Ilúvatar spoke the word of command. Ea, let things be. He sent the flame imperishable into the heart of the world, and the vision became reality. The universe was born. Many of the greatest Ainur descended into the physical world to shape it, to prepare it for the coming of elves and men. They became the Valar, the powers of Arda, bound to the world until its final end. When we understand the Ainulindale, we suddenly understand the deepest mechanics of Middle-earth. We understand why the world operates the way it does. This is why there are no spells in the traditional fantasy sense within Tolkien works. What we call magic in Middle-earth is simply an innate understanding of the great music. When the Elven smiths of a region forged magical artifacts, they were not hacking a computer code or manipulating a scientific energy field. They were singing to the matter of the world, reminding the gold and the silver of the original harmony they possessed in the timeless halls. When Lúthien cast a spell of sleep upon Morgoth, she did so by singing a song of profound, primeval power. When Tom Bombadil commands Old Man Willow to release the hobbits, he does it through rhythm and rhyme, because he is attuning himself to the primal frequency of the earth. Conversely, the dark sorcery of Sauron, the agonizing creation of the orcs, the blighting of the lands, this is all the lingering echoes of Melkor's original dissonance. It is the twisting of the song, the corruption of the physical fabric of reality. Tolkien built a world where art, language, and song are not just cultural hobbies. They are the ontological foundation of existence. The world is a song made solid. And by creating a cosmos in this manner, Tolkien was not merely writing a story. He was engaging in deeply philosophical, almost spiritual exercise. An exercise he called subcreation. Let us quiet the echoes of great battles and the grumbling of ancient ruins for a moment. Let us remain here, in the quiet sanctuary of pure thought, where the deepest ideas are born. To fully comprehend the sheer genius of Middle-earth, we must step inside the mind of the man who called it into being, and we must examine his own deeply personal philosophy of creation. We must understand not just how he builds his world, but why he believed building worlds was a fundamentally vital human endeavor. In the year 1939, standing on the precipice of a catastrophic war that would soon set the real world ablaze once again, Tolkien delivered a profoundly important lecture at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. It was titled On Fairy Stories. This was not a standard dry academic discourse on folklore. It was a passionate manifesto. It was a resolute defense of fantasy literature against a modern world that was increasingly drawing in cold, mechanical pragmatism. In those days, much like today, the fantasy genre was often met with deep intellectual disdain. Literary critics and academics treated stories of elves, dragons, and magical realms with a palpable sense of superiority. They dismissed them as childish relics, as frivolous nonsense, and, above all, as a form of intellectual cowardice. The primary accusation leveled against the creators and readers of fantasy was the charge of escapism. The critics argued that reading or writing fantasy was a desperate retreat from the burning, painful problems of objective reality into a safe, infantile illusion. It was seen as refusal to face the harsh truths of politics, economics, and modern industrial life. Tolkien, listening to these persistent accusations, felt a profound philosophical opposition. As a philologist and a scholar of myth, he decided to completely redefine the concept of escapism, stripping away its negative connotations and giving it a revolutionary new meaning. The professor asked his critics one incredibly simple yet devastatingly effective question. Why should a man be despised if finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot physically escape, why should he be condemned if he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? Tolkien astutely observed that the world outside the prison, the world of forests, sunlight, and freedom, does not become any less real just because the prisoner cannot currently see it. For Tolkien, the modern industrialized world, with its sprawling, polluted factories, its mechanical haste, its grey, soulless cities, and its crushing bureaucracy, was that very prison. He often referred to it as the iron cage of modernity. He argued that desiring to escape from such a world is not an act of cowardice, but a profound display of sanity and spiritual health. When you read fantasy, you are not the deserter fleeing the battlefield because you are afraid of duty. You are the prisoner, yearning for a fundamental freedom and truth that your daily, mechanized reality simply cannot offer. Fantasy, in Tolkien's eyes, was not a tool used to hide from the truth. It was a tool used to recover it. By stepping away from the mundane and the ordinary, the reader could once again clearly see the foundational values that the real world has blurred: loyalty, sacrifice, the breathtaking beauty of nature, and the deep, spiritual meaning of existence. From this brilliant redefinition of escapism grew Tolkien's most important aesthetic concept, the philosophy of subcreation. Tolkien was a man of profound Catholic faith. He believed that God was the one true and absolute creator, the supreme author of the primary world, the universe in which we physically live. However, because human beings were made into image and likenesses of that creator, Tolkien believed that we carry within our very nature a deep, sacred, and inescapable imperative to create. When a writer builds a fictional world, they're not committing a sin of pride, nor they padding lies. They are simply fulfilling that divine heritage. But man is not a sovereign creator. We cannot conjure matter from the absolute void. We use the materials, the concepts, and the laws that already exist in the primary world. We use words, colors, the concept of a tree, the warmth of the sun, the coldness of a stone, and we arrange them. Therefore, Tolkien argued that fantasy author is not a creator, he is a sub-creator, and the realm he builds is a secondary world. However, in order for this secondary world to possess any actual value, in order for the human mind to step inside it and truly believe in its majesty, the sub-creator must submit to one absolute, unforgiving law, a law that Tolkien called the inner consistency of reality. This is the exact point where brilliant craftsmanship separates itself from cheap imitation. Tolkien wrote that anyone can sit at a desk, take a pen, and write the words, a green sun. It is a simple juxtaposition of terms, but to construct a secondary world in which that green sun is entirely believable, a world where its emerald light authentically alters the color of the leaves, where it dictates the psychology and biology of the creatures living beneath it, where it shapes the architecture of the cities and the theology of the nations. That requires the absolute mastery of subcreation. It demands a staggering intellectual and artistic exertion. Inner consistency means that when a reader crosses the threshold into your fictional world, they must encounter ironclad, immutable rules. Those rules can be drastically different from the laws of our primary world. Elves can be immortal, dragons can breathe fire, and magic can exist. But once a rule is established, it cannot be broken, not even by the sub-creator. The author cannot cheat. They cannot bend the physical or magical laws of their own universe simply to write themselves out of a difficult plot situation. If in a critical moment of danger, a hero is suddenly saved by the illogical appearance of a new magical power that contradicts everything the reader has learned about the world so far, the illusion is instantly shattered. Tolkien called this fatal error the breaking of the spell. The very second an inconsistency appears, the reader's mind is violently ejected from the secondary world. They are thrown back into their chair in the primary world. They begin to see the narrative mechanics. They see the artificiality. They see the author pulling the strings of the puppets from above. The game is over, and the sanctuary is destroyed. This is exactly why Middle-earth possesses such a terrifyingly rigorous chronology. This is why Tolkien spent weeks meticulously calculating the phases of the moon, ensuring that when Frodo Baggins looks up at the night sky in one corner of the continent, Aragorn is looking at the exact same lunar phase hundreds of miles away. This is why distances on his map were painstakingly converted into days of marching, factoring in the terrain, the weather, and the physical exhaustion of the characters. This was not the obsessive pedantry of a madman. It was the deep, sacred responsibility of a sub-creator who knew that unyielding fidelity to detail was the only barrier protecting his world from collapsing into meaninglessness. As you listen to this, surrounded by the shadow of this study, recognize the gravity of this philosophy. Tolkien was not writing fairy tales for mere amusement. He treated the act of world building with religious and philosophical reverence. He was building a sanctuary, a refuge where the modern mind could rest from the chaos of the iron cage, submitting itself to the beautiful, severe laws of a consistent myth. But beneath all these layers of language, beneath the ruins, beneath the music and the philosophy, lies one final foundation, the most painful and the most human of all, because the true theme around which this entire architectural marvel was built is not elves or dragons or magical rings. The true subject of Middle-earth is the human terror of the end. It is death and the tragedy of immortality. Let us peel back yet another layer of Middle-earth. Let us step past the gleaming armor, look beyond the terrible majesty of the Dark Lords, and forget for a moment that spectacular magic of wizards. All of these elements, while brilliantly designed, are ultimately just a facade. They are the beautiful, ornate gargoyles carved onto the exterior of a cathedral. But if we wish to understand the true architecture of Tolkien's world building, we must look at the foundation upon which that cathedral is built. We must look at the deep, painful fracture in the human psyche that necessitated the building of this secondary world in the first place. Many superficial readers, and certainly those critics who have never bothered to descend into the deeper crypts of the legendarium, view The Lord of the Rings as a simple black and white morality tale. They see it as a rudimentary story of absolute good clashing with absolute evil, a narrative where noble knights ride out to defeat demonic hordes to save the world, and everyone lives happily ever after. But Tolkien looked at his own masterpiece through a fundamentally different lens. In one of his private letters, documents which serves as the intimate confessional diary of the sub-creator, he wrote a sentence that ought to be carved in stone above the entrance to Middle-earth. He confessed that The Lord of the Rings is not fundamentally about the quest for power. It is not even truly about the battle between good and evil. The real, underlying theme of the entire mythology, he wrote, is death and the desire for immortality. As a devout Christian, but also a scholar intimately familiar with the bleak, fatalistic nature of ancient Norse mythology, Tolkien was deeply moved by the human terror of the end. He understood that almost all of human culture, our architecture, our art, and our desperate technological progress is essentially an attempt to build a monument that will survive our own fragile, fleeing existence. We build castles of stone because we knew we are made of dust. To explore this universal terror, Tolkien constructed Middle-earth as a brilliant, dualistic anthropological laboratory. He placed two distinct races side by side, offering two diametrically opposed solutions to the exact same existential equation. He gave us the elves, and he gave us men. Let us first examine the elves. In modern pop culture, they have been reduced to beings of mere perfection, beautiful, agile, eternally youthful, and free from the degrading ravages of disease. To the untrained eye, their immortality seems like the ultimate blessing, the very thing humanity has sought since the dawn of time. But in Tolkien's architecture, elven immortality is not a blessing. It is a sentence. It is a beautiful golden cage, The elves are biologically and spiritually bound to the physical fate of Arda. Their lives will last exactly as long as the earth itself lasts. But they are living in a world that is fundamentally fallen, a world marred by the dissonance of Melkor. As the millennia drag on, the world decays, but the elves endure. Imagine the psychological horror of surviving a perfect, infallible memory and being forced to watch everything you love slowly wither and die around you. They watch the forest they planted turn to ash. They watch the great mountains erode. They watch generations of their mortal friends grow old, wither, and turn to dust in what feels like the blink of an eye. The elves are engaged in a perpetual, exhausting, and ultimately futile war against the passage of time. This is the true purpose of the three elven rings of power. They were not weapons of war. They were machines of preservation. They were created by the elves in a desperate attempt to freeze time, to stop the decay, and to keep their realms like Lothlorien and Rivendell perfectly preserved like insects trapped in amber. But it is an unnatural preservation. As the ages pass, the elves grow weary of the world. They become burdened by the crushing, cumulative weight of thousands of years of memory and grief. If they remain in Middle-earth, their spirits eventually consume their physical bodies, and they fade, becoming invisible phantoms of regret. Their immortality is a slow, beautiful tragedy. Now, contrast this with the race of men. To the elves, human beings are a terrifying, incomprehensible mystery. Men are born. They burn with a brief, chaotic intensity, and then, after a mere handful of decades, they die. And when they die, their souls do not remain bound to the circles of the world. They leave Arda entirely, going to a place that even the wisest of the Elven lords cannot see or understand. Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme creator of the cosmos, did not call death a curse. He called it the gift of man. It was a gift of absolute freedom. Men were not bound to the slow, agonizing decay of the earth. They were not trapped in the golden cage. They were granted the profound release of the moving beyond the physical universe. But the tragedy of mankind, the tragedy that drives the darkest chapters of Tolkien's history, is that humanity was deceived into fearing its own gift. The Dark Lord Morgoth cast a shadow over the heart of man early in their history. He told them to view death not as a release, but as a terrifying void. He taught them to view the elves with bitter envy. This toxic envy is the engine of the greatest catastrophe in the Second Age, the downfall of Númenor. The men of Númenor were given an island paradise, extended lifespans, and unprecedented wisdom. But it was not enough. They looked at the undying lands of the elves in the west, and they hungered for eternity. As their fear of death grew, the culture became obsessed with preservation. They stopped building houses for the living, and instead built monumental, silent tombs for the dead. They turned to dark sorcery, desperately trying to stretch their lives out. Eventually, driven mad by the fear of the end, the king of Númenor assembled the greatest armada in the history of the world and sailed west to wage war on the gods themselves, believing he could conquer immortality by force. The result was apocalyptic. Eru Ilúvatar intervened. The world was broken. The seas opened up, and the entire island of Numenor was swallowed by the abyss, lost beneath the waves forever. When you understand this, you realize that the One Ring itself is not merely a tool for invisibility or a generic artifact of evil. The ring is the ultimate manifestation of the fear of death. When a mortal wears the ring or possesses it for too long, they do not gain true immortality. As Gollum and Bilbo discovered, their life is merely stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. The ring holds the natural progression, dragging the soul into an agonizing, faded twilight existence. The faith of the Nazgul, men who were so terrified of death that they traded their humanity to become eternal, empty shadows. This is the brilliant, devastating architecture of Middle-earth. The magic is merely a metaphor. The grand, sweeping mythology is a backdrop. At its very core, the world-building of Tolkien is a profound, melancholic meditation on the human condition. It is a story about how we deal with the agonizing reality of letting things go. It is the sorrow of the elves fading into the west, and it is the fear of men staring into the dark. But a mythology built solely upon the crushing weight of cosmic grief and deep time would eventually become too heavy for any reader to bear. A world made entirely of ancient ruins, immortal sorrows, and apocalyptic wars needed an anchor. It needs something small, something grounded, and something entirely unmagical to give the epic scale its true meaning. It needs the Shire. There is a fundamental architectural limit to how much epic scale the human mind can comfortably endure. If a creator builds a world consisting entirely of towering obsidian citadels, apocalyptic wars, immortal beings, and unfathomable cosmic grief, they run the risk of collapsing their own structure. When every single element of a story is dialed up to the absolute maximum of mythical intensity, a strange psychological phenomenon occurs within the reader: numbness, epic fatigue. When everything is magical, nothing is magical. When every character is a demigod or a tragic king, we lose our capacity to feel genuine awe. Tolkien, having spent decades constructing the dense, high mythology of the Silmarillion, understood this danger perfectly. He knew that the grand history of the First and Second Ages was too heavy, too archaic, and too distant from the modern human experience to serve as a traditional narrative. It was pure, unadulterated myth, reading more like the Old Testament or the poetic Edda than a novel. To bring the reader into this universe without crushing them beneath the weight of deep time, the architecture of Middle-earth required a completely different kind of foundation. It needed an anchor, something small, something utterly unmagical, and something profoundly mundane. It needed the Shire. From a purely historical and anthropological perspective within the lore of Middle-earth, the Shire makes absolutely no sense. It is a deliberate, brilliant anachronism. While the rest of the continent is locked in a dark, quasi-medieval struggle for survival, with kings wielding ancient swords and their dark lords breeding armies in volcanic ash, the Shire exists in a bubble of anachronistic comfort. It is essentially a romanticized vision of 19th century Victorian rural England, dropped squarely into the middle of mythological Bronze and Iron Age worlds. The hobbits have mantelpiece clocks, they carry umbrellas, they wear waistcoats with brass buttons, they have a postal service, they argue about inheritances, they smoke pipeweed, and they are deeply, profoundly concerned with the punctuality of their 6 daily meals. They have no concept of global politics, no understanding of dark magic, and zero interest in the epic histories of elves or men. To the hobbits, a great adventure is simply a disruption of a quiet, respectable life. It is something that makes you late for dinner. This juxtaposition is not a mistake, nor is it a whimsical joke. It is one of the most powerful world-building mechanisms ever devised. By creating the Shire, Tolkien established a baseline of normalcy. Think of it like a painting. If you want to paint a mountain that looks impossibly tall, you do not just paint the mountain. You paint a tiny, insignificant human figure standing at the very base of the canvas, looking up. The contrast provides the scale. The hobbits are the tiny figures at the base of Tolkien's mythology. They serve as the ultimate rhythm surrogate. We, the modern readers, living in our industrialized world, cannot truly relate to the existential sorrow of a 3,000-year-old elf. We cannot fully comprehend the noble, bloodline-driven duty of an exiled ranger of the north. But we can relate to a hobbit. We understand the simple joy of a warm hearth, a good meal, a well-tended garden, and the comfort of a familiar bed. We understand the fear of stepping outside our front door into a vast, unknown, and dangerous world. Because we view the epic landscape of Middle-earth primarily through the eyes of Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, the magic of the world retains its terrifying and wondrous power. If the protagonist of The Lord of the Rings had been an elven warrior like Legolas, the journey would have been fundamentally different and far less engaging. To an elf, an encounter with Lady Galadriel is as simply meeting with a respected elder. To an elf, walking through a magical forest is a natural occurrence. The magic would be normalized, and therefore it would lose its mystery. But because we walk beside hobbits, every encounter is magnified to its proper mythological proportions. When Merry and Pippin wander into Fangorn Forest and meet Treebird, we do not just see a walking tree. Through the terrified, awestruck hobbit eyes, we are encountering the ancient, incomprehensible depth of nature itself. We are meeting a being whose perception of time is so vast that the passing of human expires feels to him like the changing of the seasons. The sheer towering scale of the Ents works precisely because the hobbits are so small. When Frodo meets Aragorn in the corner of the prancing pony in Bree, he does not see the majestic, prophesied king of Gondor. He sees a dangerous, weather-beaten wanderer in muddy boots and a torn cloak. We discover the majesty of the king slowly, organically, only as the hobbits themselves slowly begin to understand the depth of the world they have stumbled into. And when they finally reach the golden woods of Lothlorien, the elves are not presented as familiar allies. To the hobbits, they are terrifyingly alien. They are beautiful, yes, but dangerous in their perfection. They are akin to angels or nature spirits, vibrating on a frequency that mortal, mundane creatures can barely withstand. The hobbits translate the high, inaccessible myth into a language we can emotionally process. They anchor the cosmic struggle to the earth. This grounded perspective also redefines the very nature of heroism within the architecture of the story. In ancient epics, heroes fought for glory, for the spoils of war, or to earn a place among the gods. Achilles fought for eternal renown. Beowulf fought for gold and prestige. But the hobbits do not care about glory. When they march to the gates of Mordor, they are not fighting to conquer a kingdom. They are not fighting to seize a throne. They are fighting for something infinitely more precious and infinitely more fragile. They are fighting so that the Shire can remain the Shire. They march into the darkest, most terrifying nightmare the world has ever known, simply so that the mundane, quiet, ordinary life can continue to exist somewhere in the world, even if they themselves cannot return to it. It is the ultimate defense of the ordinary against the tyranny of the epic. I have found that it is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, Gandalf says. Small acts of kindness and love. Without the Shire, Middle-earth is just a beautifully constructed, melancholic museum of ruined empires and fading magic. But with the Shire, it becomes a home worth saving. The mundane does not detract from the myth, it validates it. It gives the sword strikes a purpose. It gives the sacrifices a meaning. We have now mapped the deep architecture of Arda. We have traced its roots from the first spoken syllable through the ways of its ruins, the music of its creation, the philosophy of its maker, and the grounded, simple earth of its smallest inhabitants. There is only one final thing left to do before we close this ledger for the night. We must look at what happens when the architect finally puts down his quill and the light of his world begins to fade. And so, in the quiet solitude of this night, we finally reach the western shores of our very first map. The heavy, leather-bound ledger that we opened together is slowly drawing its first chapter to a close. And the fading light of the candle on this desk serves as a gentle reminder of the inevitable end of every great tale. We have traveled a remarkably long and exhausting road tonight. We have traversed the vast intellectual distance from a single, whispered syllable in a forgotten philologist's study through the cosmic, shattering symphony of the Ainur in the timeless hall. We have navigated the severe, uncompromising philosophy of subcreation, and we have felt the crushing, melancholic wave of the ancient ruins and deep time. Finally, we found our safe harbor, anchoring this sprawling myth to the warm, mundane earth of the smallest and the humblest of creatures. We have successfully mapped the architecture of Middle-earth, not by tracing its military supply lines or memorizing its dynastic successions, but by examining the profound psychological, linguistic, and artistic craftsmanship that forms its bedrock. As we stand here at the end of the Third Age, watching the Elven ships disappear into the mists of the West, we must ask ourselves one final, overreaching question. It is a question that has haunted literary critics, scholars, and armies of aspiring fantasy writers for nearly a century. Where lies the true, untouchable legacy of Tolkien's method? And why, despite the passage of time, despite the birth of hundreds of subgenres, and despite thousands of authors possessing incredibly powerful modern writing tools, has no one ever managed to replicate Middle-earth with complete, authentic success? The answer to that question is hidden in the architectural flaw we discussed at the very beginning of this session. Almost all Tolkien's imitators, the countless creators who filled bookstore shelves with thick, sprawling volumes of so-called epic fantasy in the decades that followed, committed the exact same fundamental technical sin. They looked at the monumental success of Lord of the Rings, but they only looked at the surface. They assumed that the recipe for a masterpiece was merely a matter of gathering the correct ingredients and mixing them together. They believed you simply had to draw a massive, jagged map. You had to invent a brooding Dark Lord in a spiked helmet. You had to forge an ancient artifact of apocalyptic power, assemble a diverse fellowship of recurrent heroes, and throw them all into a whirlwind of grand cinematic battles. This is the fatal error of building a world from the top down. It is the creation of a stage set. Modern authors frequently design their universes as commercial scale models. These worlds are hastily erected solely to service a pre-planned, fast-paced plot. Their lore, their history, and their mythology are treated like extra features on a product specification sheet. They are included because the genre demands it, but they possess no autonomous life. When the reader looks away from the main protagonist, when the camera stops rolling, you can feel that the world behind them simply ceases to exist, collapsing back into a flat, empty void of white paper. Tolkien did the exact opposite. He built his world from the bottom up, beginning with the deepest, most invisible and most painstaking foundations. Middle-earth was not created to act as a convenient backdrop for an exciting plot. The plot, the War of the Ring itself, was merely the final natural fruit that grew from ancient, deep-reaching roots that had been planted decades prior. Tolkien created the languages first. The languages, through their unique musical phonetics and rigorous grammatical structures, necessitated the creation of a specific psychology for the beings who spoke them. This unique psychology gave birth to a desperate need for cultural expression, which in turn demanded the creation of a cosmic mythology of music and divine creation. That mythology, rolling across the millennia of the First and Second Ages, left behind physical, agonizing scars on the landscape in the form of shattered ruins, forgotten tombs, and pervasive, melancholic sense of deep time. And only at the very end of this agonizingly long process, in this incredibly dense environment saturated with history, consequence, and unyielding logic, did hobbits appear. And with them, the story we all know. Middle-earth feels so terrifyingly, breathtakingly real because it possesses its own autonomous gravity. It does not need you, the reader, to exist. You have the inescapable subconscious feeling that if you were to close the book right now and never return to it for the rest of your life, the elves in Rivendell would still sing their sorrowful songs under the stars. The dwarves would still dig relentlessly in the dark, echoing depths of Moria, and the sun would still rise over the Shire, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawns of Bag End. This is the absolute, unmatched triumph of true subcreation. The spell of the inner consistency of reality was cast so perfectly and maintained so rigidly that the secondary world actually gained a soul of its own. Tolkien's method remains utterly uncopyable because it requires a level of personal sacrifice and patience that our modern, hyper-stimulated world no longer tolerates. It requires spending an entire lifetime debating the etymological root of a single fictional word. It requires treating world building not as a commercial literary craft designed to sell millions of copies, but as a profound philosophical act, as a spiritual sanctuary. And that is exactly what Middle Earth remains for us today. For those of us living in the 21st century, locked inside the noisy, relentless iron cages of modernity that, that the professor wrote about, this mythology is a safe haven. It is a place we escape to not to hide from the truth, but to recover it. When the darkness outside your window becomes too thick and the exhausting pace of daily life begins to overwhelm your senses, the wisdom of this ancient myth allows you to rediscover the proper proportions of things. It reminds you that even the smallest, most mundane and overlooked creature can alter the fate of the entire world, if only they remain steadfast and true to simple, pure values. Thank you for spending this night in my study, as you listen to the sound of the rain against the glass and watch the dying glow of the embers in the hearth. Allow your thoughts to finally slow down. You are safe here. Time does not hold the same cruel meaning in this room as it does on the outside. You may close your eyes and rest. Our first volume has been officially opened, and the foundation has been set in stone. But the work of the cartographer is never truly finished. We are not yet ready to leave the borders of Arda. Next week, when we kindle the fire in this heart once again, we will step away from the grand maps and the ancient ruins. We will look inward. We will examine the absolute, crushing ways of the shadow. We will explore the tragic, stoic, and profoundly beautiful philosophy of hope. And we will answer the most difficult and painful question of the entire mythology. Why did Frodo Baggins have to fail? We will discover why no mortal mind could ever withstand the ultimate corruption of the ring, and why, in the final desperate moment on the edge of the abyss, it was not the strength of armies, but a single, quiet act of mercy that saved the world. Prepare yourself for that journey into the dark. But for now, sleep well. The rain is still falling.